If you weren't here last night, let me also introduce my colleague, Alex Ellish. We've been traveling together for the last week across to Vancouver and back again, engaging with quite a number of pastor clusters and a variety of other events. And we're again going to share the presentation this morning. Now, we're not sure whether this works or not, but I'm getting a thumbs up from the back, so hopefully it will work. When I was invited to present at this assembly, as well as the overall theme of where do we find God in the neighbourhood, it was also suggested that we might reflect a bit on two other topics, really quite briefly this morning, being an active minority and the theme of hope. So that's really what I want to focus on this morning. Have we come to terms with, are we coming to terms with the reality that the Christian community in the West is no longer a majority community at the centre of culture, but a minority community? A minority community in a plural culture. A minority community surrounded by other minorities, one among many. That's very different from where we've been for many centuries. And what I'm interested in, and what I've been reflecting on for the last couple of years, is the transition from majority to minority. It's not just that we're a minority community. Christians in many parts of the world are minorities and always have been minorities. We are not that kind of minority. We are an ex-majority minority. And that's significantly different. We are a minority with memories of being majority. And there's a transition which is quite tricky. It's a transition that presents us with a range of challenges. It's working. Very briefly, we don't have all the resources we used to have. One of the reasons why Mennonite Church Canada is going through a restructuring process at present, and why many other denominations across Western culture are going through something similar, is a reduction of resources. There are other reasons as well, but lack of resources is challenging our structures and our programs. We don't have as many people as we used to have. We're still a very significant minority, but not what we used to be. We can't therefore maintain all the programs and activities we used to be able to. And that's making some of our churches quite weary, trying to maintain programs that were designed for communities twice the size with half as many people. We don't have the influence we used to have, at least not in the same way. We don't have the same access to power. And we haven't perhaps yet adjusted our tone, the way we say things. A prophetic minority is rather different from a moral majority. The language we use, the tone of voice, it needs to change. If, as a minority, we still speak as if we were a majority, quite understandably, our society gets irritated. It just feels hollow. So there are quite a number of challenges. I'm interested, I guess, particularly in asking, if we are a minority, if we now accept that, what kind of minority do we want to be? I don't think we have any choice about being a minority, but we have many choices in relation to what kind of minority. We could be a disconsolate, grumpy, beleaguered minority, hankering for past influence, fearful for the future, fractious, infighting, drawing the barricades around us, hoping somehow to survive. That is an extremely unattractive proposition. That's not the kind of minority that I want to be part of. As I've been talking, and Alex and I have been traveling over the last couple of weeks, we've been looking particularly at three kinds of minorities. Is it possible for us to conceive of ourselves as a creative minority, a prophetic minority, and a hopeful minority? One of the things about minorities is that they can do things that majorities wouldn't dream of doing. Minorities are not as invested in the status quo as majorities. Minorities can see things that majorities overlook. Minorities can take risks and not be too worried about failure. minorities could pioneer things that in due course others will pick up as well. There are things that minorities can't do, but there are things that only minorities can do. Is it possible for us to think of ourselves as a creative minority and to wonder whether actually God might be leading us into that role, at least for the time being? A creative minority. We haven't got time this morning to look in detail at all of these, so I want to focus particularly on what it might mean to be a hopeful minority. What would it mean for us to be a minority that is characterized by hope? Not by despair, not by discouragement, declining numbers, fewer resources. There are many things that we could think, well, I wish it were like it were some years ago. Well, it's not. Can we look forward? What would it mean to be a hopeful minority? What might we be hoping for? Well, a variety of things we could hope for. One thing we might hope for across Western culture is that eventually our society begins to recognize that there is a vacuum at the heart of our culture, that the foundations on which Western society has been built were Christian foundations, among other things. There were other influences too, but the Christian story was a significant shaping influence. As that story becomes unknown and unbelieved, as the foundations begin to disappear, it's almost as if our culture is free-floating, like a house built in the air. Might we hope that at some point our culture recognizes that, realizes that the foundations just aren't there, begins to look again for a story that is strong enough and persuasive enough to shape our culture? Dare we hope for that? Might we hope that the reverse mission flow that is characterizing our world might make a significant impact? I don't quite know what the situation here is in Canada, but certainly in Europe, far more missionaries are coming to Europe than are going from Europe. There is a significant shift in global mission. Many of the missionaries coming to Europe from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, come with a deep sense of commitment to mission in what they now regard as the dark continent, the godless continent. I know many West African missionaries in particular in Britain, and many of them use the language of indebtedness. Your forefathers, your foremothers brought the gospel to us some generations ago. We are now repaying the debt. They are planting churches at quite a rate of knots. Churches are proliferating and growing. At present, they haven't quite worked out how to plant beyond the African diaspora. They haven't yet worked out how to engage with indigenous Europeans. If they manage that, it could be a game changer. We need to pray that the reverse mission that is going on all over Western culture reaches its fulfillment, is able to be that kind of cross-cultural mission movement that under God could transform the situation. What are you hoping for? What are you expecting? What can we reach out for? Fundamentally, however, our hope is not in any of those things. Our hope isn't in a little bit of growth in our churches. It isn't in institutional survival. It isn't that somehow Mennonite Church Canada will push through these current discussions and emerge stronger and more beautiful. Fundamentally, our hope is in the God who loves humanity and all of creation, and the God who has promised new heavens and a new earth. And we dare not let our hope rest in anything less than that. And that hope is rooted in the resurrection of Jesus. Some of you may have heard of the missiologist Leslie Newbigin. He's written many books on missiology. He was a bishop in the Church of South India for many years, and then came back ostensibly to retire to Britain, although all sorts of new things began to open up for him. And one of the things he discovered in Britain was the difference between India and Britain in relation to this question of hope. He said, in spite of awful poverty in India, down every back street, there are people full of hope, trying new things, starting new businesses, new initiatives, came back to Britain and felt this is a hopeless culture, a culture that has lost imagination, that has lost vision. He was asked once, "Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the church?" I don't know how you would respond to that. I've been asked that question lots of times as I travel. I wish I had thought of Leslie Newbigin's answer many years ago. When he was asked that question, he simply said this: "I believe that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. Therefore, the question doesn't arise." It's a good answer. Our hope is not based on a bit of optimism or a bit of pessimism, on short-term possibilities. Our hope is rooted in the resurrection and in the promises of God, that what God did for Jesus on Easter Sunday, he will do for the whole of creation. That's the basis of our hope. So what does it mean, briefly, to live in the light of the resurrection, in the light of God's promised future? How should we live as a hopeful minority? I just want to suggest two things as samples, just samples. Many, many other things we could talk about, but just to get us thinking. And they may not look particularly radical. They may not even look particularly exciting, but I wonder whether they are quite significant. And the first of those is stability. A society that lacks hope is constantly tinkering, constantly investing in new ideas, new programs, new initiatives, and replacing one with another before the first one's had a chance to take effect. We live in a society that is looking for short-term results. Talk to those who work in education or health services. Every new initiative comes along before the last one has really worked itself out, and people get weary and discouraged and disillusioned. Not another new program. That could affect our churches too, as we're sold yet another church growth program, yet another evangelistic tool, yet another program, product, initiative. In Britain, we have been plagued with lots and lots of American programs over the last many years. Not Canadian, of course. They come highly recommended. They come beautifully packaged. They're very expensive, and they don't work. They don't work because the cultural context is so different. But the temptation in a minority community that is experiencing some decline is to invest all our hopes in the latest program and then to jump to the next one if that doesn't work. Church members can be tempted to jump from congregation to congregation, looking for something better than they've known before. Instability. Maybe one of the signs of a community that is invested in hope is the ability to be stable, to persist, to take the long-term view. Alex has got 3 snapshots that illustrate what that might mean.
These are only short stories, little pictures that have caught in time. So a couple that we know moved into government housing in the city of Derby, which is in the East Midlands. And they had a vision for community transformation. When they moved in quite recently, they told their friends that they were willing to be there for the next 30 years, because that was how long that was going to take for their community to change. 30 years. A second snapshot. Urban Expression, the mission church planting organization that Stuart and I work for, will be 20 years old next year. And one of the first teams was based in the community that I lived until recently. The team met lots of teenagers, they got to know local people, and one of the first teenagers that our team got to know was a young man called Dave. Dave's family was very chaotic, and he often ended up spending time with the team, hanging out in their home, and eating with them. Time went on, and Dave drifted away from the team. He drifted away from the church community that was beginning to evolve. But in the last 3 years or so, Dave has been sort of hanging around a bit more. He's been coming to our community meals. He's been helping out with a homeless project. He knows what it is to be homeless. And he remembers and talks about the friendships that he had with those team members. And because some of the same people have been there for 20 years, they know the story. They know his story. And although it didn't look like anything was happening in Dave's life when he was a teenager, something is starting to happen now. Fruit is starting to grow because of the faithfulness of this community and because of the work of God. 20 years down the line. A third story. This is an interesting story because we have these strange creatures in the UK called hyphenated Anabaptists. So I'm a Baptist Anabaptist. We have Anglican Anabaptists. We have some Salvation Army Anabaptists. It's very interesting. So this is an Anglican Anabaptist, which is a very curious thing. You can talk to Stuart about that afterwards, because it's a friend of his. And his name is Chris. He is the chair of a reconciliation ministry that came out of the London Mennonite Centre, and he's the chair of Bridge Builders. So he lives in a poor urban community, and he was working with his congregation on a neighbourhood project. And they kept on coming up against all sorts of difficulties, particularly with their local authority. Whenever they wanted to try something, they were just sort of stopped in their tracks by red tape and silly stuff like that. And Chris said to us that his congregation had a vocation to outlast, outpray, and if necessary, outsuffer all who hinder or oppose the advance of God's mission in their community.
How's that for a vocation? To outlast, outpray, and outsuffer all who oppose God's kingdom in your community. Stability. Doesn't sound exciting, but in a culture of short-termism, in a culture that is devoid of hope, I think stability may be one of the gifts that a minority community can offer. We are not going anywhere. We're here for the long term. We're here to see it through. We're committed to our neighbourhoods. We're committed to finding what God is doing here and joining in. We are staying. Stability. And the second suggestion is gratitude, thankfulness. If a society that lacks hope is characterized by instability, it's also characterized by complaining and grumbling. A society that is looking for someone to blame for everything that goes wrong. Yes, there is a proper accountability when things go wrong, but scapegoating, always looking for someone to blame, I think that goes well beyond that. I don't know whether it's the same here in Canada as in Britain, but listening to conversations in supermarkets or at bus queues, there's an awful lot of grumbling going on, awful lot of complaining, and not a great deal of gratitude. And the result of that tends to be passivity, skepticism, and reluctance to join anything. It's not just churches, you know, that are losing members at the moment. All over Western culture, people are not joining organizations. They're not joining political parties, trade unions, voluntary organizations. There is a lack of engagement. And I think it partly comes out of this lack of hope, this grumbling and complaining. And it dominates the news media. Whichever news channel you watch, it's almost all bad news. 30 minutes of news headlines, 27.5 minutes of bad news, and then some silly story about a very clever hamster, just to light up our day and think, oh, well, perhaps the world's all right after all. You get that in Canada too, by the sound of it. Okay. One of the questions is, does the news media drive the grumbling and the complaining and the negativity, or does it simply reflect it? Do we blame the media for this, or is it simply reflecting what we think anyway? A few years ago, a Russian regional newspaper, which operates through a web-based system rather than through print media, said that on a particular date, its website was only going to publish good news. There will be no bad news that day. It's only going to be good news. They reported afterwards that they lost 75% of their readership that day. People didn't want to read just good news, it seems. So is it the media? Is it us? Alex has another story of an attempt to subvert this culture of negativity.
So this is a powerful and amusing story of trying to subvert some of this negative perceptions of reality. And it was sort of an experiment by a designer, an artist, and a woman who calls herself a tinkerer. She says she wants to create disruptive wonder. In 2008, she and a team of people got together, and without any permission from anyone else, they decided to produce and distribute hundreds of thousands of counterfeit New York Times newspapers. So they dated it 6 months into the future, so it was already 2008, but 6 months into the future. And this counterfeit was full of stories from the war in Iraq ending, to banker salaries being capped, and universal free healthcare. They then filmed people's reactions. So they went into the streets and gave them out. They actually gave out some of them in front of the New York Times head office, which I think is very pleasing. And they then filmed people's reactions as they read this good news. And people are just in total shock and wonder, as you can imagine. People stopping as they're crossing the street in the middle of the walkway and just completely aghast. You might not be able to see it on the picture, but the counterfeit tagline, instead of the official tagline, which is all the news that's fit to print, they changed it to all the news we hope to print. Hopeful and disruptive, challenging a dominant story.
I do like that phrase, disruptive wonder. I wonder whether that's part of the vocation of a Christian minority community. To be subversive, to be disruptive, to ask questions, to be provocative, to get people to ask the question, what if life could be different in my neighborhood, in my world? These, as I say, may not sound very exciting ways forward, but I do wonder whether stability and gratitude, among other things, might actually mark out as quite distinctive a hopeful minority. Maybe we have a similar vocation to that of Kelly Anderson, to encourage and invite our neighbours and our friends to imagine a different kind of world, to imagine the kind of world that God has promised, to imagine a world that is more hopeful, more gentle, more generous. It may be that that's something a minority community can do that a majority community would never have been able to do. May God guide us as we journey on from being a majority to a minority, as we go through some of the pain of restructuring, as we begin to embrace the possibility of reimagining and infusing our communities for the possibilities that are open to a prophetic, a creative, and a hopeful minority.